and I'll talk shortly about the region. We produce annual report on the state of Arab environment. And 3 years ago, our report was on ecological footprint. We produced an ecological footprint atlas on the Arab region. I have the full report here, so the one who will ask the best question will take it. That atlas was meant to show how do we consume our resources and do we understand what we are doing. It showed, for example, that the ecological footprint in Arab countries per capita over the past 50 years doubled, while the biocapacity went down by half. We found that a country like UAE and Qatar consumes that much that if everyone in the world consumes the same, we need 6 planets. While a country like Yemen consumes too little per capita that if the whole world consumes like Yemen, we would need only half a planet Earth. So we started just telling people how important it is to manage our natural capital in a good way. In many cases, it has been considered as something free, a free gift of God. So when we consume oil, it was considered that we are consuming something which we can have always, not that we are drawing from our capital, which is not returned. We are not drawing from our interest, from our return on investment. We are getting our capital. Now, when things change like this, and people start to understand that they have to treat natural capital in a different way, at the beginning they are afraid. They think this is risky, they will lose opportunities. They are right, because private sector cannot invest if there are no regulations which will create an even playing field for everybody. Things started changing, and what we heard in the morning, we realized this. Especially after the Paris Climate Agreement, a clear signal was given to the private sector that the world is going in another direction. What happened 2 weeks ago for the HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, it never happened before, because the chemical industries this time led the way to say we want to phase out HFCs. Why? Not because they are a charity, because they had the signal that the world is changing and regulations will be put in place. Before the regulations were there, they developed alternatives for HFCs. With the chlorofluorocarbon CFCs, when it started, they needed time to develop alternatives. Now the private sector, as they sense there are signals of change, they start to develop their alternatives to be faster than the public sector. So what we explain to people is the following, as we are now with financial people, that when you go to a bank to get a loan, money, you sign or you put your fingerprint. When you default, they can have some financial architecture, they change things, you can print banknotes, you can buy time for some years. So this is your fingerprint in the financial sector. And then nature, it is your footprint. What you consume in nature, you cannot bring again. Many things, when they go, they are gone. So this is understood now, and that's why we see the shift to acceptance of green economy, which is the answer to the deterioration which we had in the natural assets. So this panel now, we have people who are hands-on. Everyone works in his own field and will give us his own experience of what he does. So that you don't forget who they are I shall introduce them one by one before they talk. If I introduce all now, you will forget when he comes to talk who he is. So we shall have now a general overview of the issue with Bilal Rahil. Bilal is the Director of Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice at the World Bank. So Bilal will talk to us why we are considering environmental assets in the finance sector and the link between development objectives and the private sector. So, Bill, please.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to be here with you. I'm with the World Bank. Before the World Bank, I was in fact with the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, where I was senior manager in their Environment, Social, and Governance department. You can hear me, right? Sounds okay? Terrific. And I was very active in the area of natural capital. IFC was one of the early signatories of the Natural Capital Declaration, the NCD, and I had the pleasure of being the first chair of its steering committee. So I'm delighted to be here to discuss with you investing in and building environmental assets. And we'll talk in a minute about what is an environmental asset. Of course, I think this will be of interest to asset owners and to financial institutions who support these asset owners or these entities that are pursuing the acquisition of assets. And of course, it is always about risks and opportunities. And I hope that this afternoon we can set the risks aside a bit and focus a bit on the opportunities and the tools that we need to pull together to really understand and see these opportunities as they exist. So I'm going to try and frame the discussion. I will touch on a couple of elements of the conceptual framework around environmental assets. Scope out for us what I think are the target environmental assets, because the definition of environmental assets can be very, very broad, and I think here we need to focus a bit. And also provide a couple of examples from the work of the World Bank and the IFC in terms of what we have done and what we will be doing in terms of investing in and building environmental assets. In terms of the conceptual framework, for those of you that are familiar with natural capital and the emerging discussion around natural capital, there is a discussion of stock and flows. And a lot of work, a lot of discussion is around the flows. That is, those ecosystem services, those benefits that we get from the stock of natural capital, that stock of asset. And this includes, for example, water, clean air, erosion protection, flood protection, and so on. So I think the idea of this session is in part to go upstream in the discussion. If, in fact, we can appreciate that nature provides us with a number of different services that are critical for life, not just human life, but all lives, what about investing in environmental assets, in the stock itself? So this is the objective of our discussion this afternoon. Now, in terms of what consists this stock, what are the environmental assets, I looked around a bit, and I found an accounting framework that breaks down the assets into 7 categories. And this is a framework that I believe was developed or used by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, but also by the World Bank's WAVES program, which is the Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services, which is a donor-funded program where the World Bank works with a number of countries in really trying to develop an understanding of natural assets. So this accounting framework of environmental assets has 7 different categories as follows: mineral and energy resources, land, soil resources, timber resources, aquatic resources, all other biological resources, and water resources. And I think from an accounting perspective, perhaps it's a very all-encompassing framework, but from a strategic, operational, more thematic way, operationally, what we have done is take these 7 categories and capture them in 3 blocks of resources. First one being non-living resources, oil and gas, all the mining products, for example. Second being living resources, timber, fish, and so on. And third, ecosystems and ecosystem processes. not ecosystem services, but ecosystem processes. That is the grouping of different elements of the environment which together provide an ecosystem that has unique features and has value in and of itself. For example, a forest would probably fall into that category. And my sense is that where we want to go with this discussion is not to discuss non-living environmental assets, but it's about living resources and ecosystem processes. So I think the opportunity really that we are looking at is one where we want to increase investments in the stock of environmental assets that consist of living natural resources and ecosystem processes. And what is the nature of these investments? I would say that it's an investment which seeks to protect, improve, or manage an asset with the objective of impacting either the quality or the quantity of flow coming out of it. So we're really, again, focusing around that upstream environmental asset and not the services that flow from this asset. In terms of the type of investment that we have often discussed around environmental assets, many of these investments have been indirect investments. For example, if we reduce the flow of pollution going into the ocean, we are in fact increasing the value of an asset. Yes, we are, but that is an indirect investment. I think what is interesting here and what we were thinking about more substantively is about direct investments. And what are perhaps some of the types of direct investments into environmental assets? And let me give you a couple of examples. The first type of direct investment is one where we are investing in the protection or conservation of an asset. And through financial or policy intervention, we are securing the environmental or ecosystem services flows, or increasing or optimizing these flows. And an example that is often used is that of New York City and its investment in its upstream watershed, which provides drinking water for the city of New York, perhaps for all 5 boroughs, I'm not sure. So that is an example of a direct investment in an environmental assets to secure and deliver important services. In terms of the World Bank's work, we certainly also have been active in those types of investment. A common example is one that is closely linked to our support for hydropower development. So as part of these investments, very often we have related investments in watersheds related to reforestation, stabilization of mountains, with the objective here of reducing erosion and siltation around and into the dam. So again, here it's an investment in an environmental asset with a direct benefit to a project. Another type of direct investment I think can be defined as follows: is an investment that increases the size of an asset to further increase its impact. And here, through the work that the bank has recently done on its forest sector action plan, we have found that investments in commercial reforestation or any large-scale reforestation, in fact, represents an investment in an asset with potentially very high returns, certainly in terms of economic returns, but also very high social benefits associated with that as well. And it doesn't always have to be large-scale. Smallholder plantations and small-scale tree planting as well, in an aggregate at a landscape level can yield some important benefits. So this also represents, I believe, an important type of investment in an environmental asset. Recent work around the blue economy in the Caribbean also suggests that direct investment in coastal zone rehabilitation can also lead to an increase in the quality of the ocean asset, of the blue economy asset, and yield increased revenues. So here we are. I think the challenge for the financial sector to become more comfortable with this, what I see as an emerging opportunity, is important. I think there are elements, well, what we would like to know from the financial sector, and perhaps we'll touch on that today, what are elements of an enabling environment that are essential or perhaps are absent in terms of supporting more direct investments in environmental assets? How can we de-risk investments as well in environmental assets. What can the World Bank, what can central banks, what can be done to help improve the environment in which these investments might be considered. And finally, I think for the financial sector, for any investor, asset holder or financial sector, the whole question of valuation becomes very, very important. How do we value, how do you value an environmental asset? How do we value the flows coming out of that environmental asset? Because valuation is very important to understand, to get a better sense in terms of the return on investment. And of course, as you look at a new class of investments, as environmental assets might turn out to be, I think valuation, which is attracting a lot of attention these days, becomes a very important tool to support this effort. So with this, Najib, I'm happy to hand this back over to you, and I hope I didn't take too much time in my introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Now we shall be having Mr. Steve Lambert. Steve is the Executive General Manager for Capital Financing at National Australia Bank, NAB. We shall get from him a perspective from Australia about what is the finance sector doing, for example, for your bank, NAB. What about your agricultural portfolio? How do you select it?
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. I'm going to do my presentation sitting down. I'm quite comfortable at this point, so I thought I'd do that. Maybe just a couple of bits. I guess I could take this conversation a few different ways, but for us as a bank, we're a large commercial bank in Australia. Historically, obviously natural resources, either renewable or sustainable and not so, plus agriculture, are really the core foundations for most of our history of Australian economic prosperity. So it's very important in our market that in both how we deal with natural resources and agriculture, we think around the long term, and we think very much around sustainability in both those areas of financing. The other bit as a bank, we're Australia's largest agricultural lender. So something like $1 in every 3, in fact probably even more, say around 40% of all lending inside the farm gate in Australia is done by National Australia Bank. So we've got a very large portfolio all around Australia in basically every type of agricultural activity in the country, which is a significant export industry for Australia. So that's the first bit. And the interesting thing, I guess, I would also take the point that historically a lot of the discussion is around, in parts of the bank, is around risk mitigation. How do we make better risk decisions from thinking around, which of our customers is more or less exposed to climate change, which of our customers is doing a better or a worse job around things like biodiversity, around the health of the soil, et cetera, And historically, it's been difficult to get that data. It's been difficult sometimes to see through the white noise around which of our clients are actually less risky because they're having sustainable farming techniques and things like that. So that's one area that we're doing a lot of work on. We sort of work on that with partners, people like the CSIRO in Australia, the government research organisation, working with them on a very large scale cropping study in Australia. So that's been a really big source of data. So using the data that we've collected for 150 odd years of lending to sort of use that to try and make better risk decisions. We do things at state levels, working in Tasmania between the government and the universities around sensor technology to get better data at a very, in a micro point of view to try to get better analysis there. We work with certain industry bodies, the dairy industry, the wine industry, etc. So one bit is definitely, we're doing a lot of work at the moment around the data because quite often it's actually hard to tell from a risk point of view. My approach is a bit different. My approach is basically, it's similar to what Bilal said, it's around sort of more opportunity. My role was around saying, look, for 150 years we've lent money. To me, the question is not, can you grab natural value assets? I mean, in the banking system, they already exist. They're called loans on our books. The issue for me is making sure you can then potentially get other investors interested in those loans. How do you bring new capital into the system? How do you bring capital that has a different risk horizon potentially to the banks into the system? How do you bring capital that people are really, really motivated by both a return and a social good? How do you bring that? How do you enable those investments? And probably the best, I'll give you three or so examples. I've worked with Sean at the end on a couple of these, but it's the same thinking for us. We're a very active lender in the renewable energy space in Australia, also Europe, but in Australia, very active, by far the largest lender. What that meant was I just had a big balance sheet of typically wind farms or solar facilities in Australia. And what we basically did is we created off the back of that a green bond issued by my bank, supported by those assets. So we found investors who were interested, wanted to get an investment that was, had a certified tick from Sean that it was actually green, that they knew that their money was going to something worthwhile, in this case, wind farms in Australia, but it was facilitated by my team. At the end of the day, my team has got the expertise to analyse wind farms, to analyse shifts in wind patterns, analyse the ability to get your money back. And the deal we did, basically, the investor took NAB risk, but the underlying asset was a wind farm. We did something similar a little bit later around a green securitisation. Sorry, I would say that, and that was done in December 2014. It was the first certified green bond, I think, for a commercial bank anywhere in the world. And great thing is, we were just talking about it before, subsequently it's been copied by a number of other commercial banks, not just in Australia, but outside Australia. So that was a great thing. 2015, we did something similar with a green securitisation. So we created a different style of instrument, in this case related to lending for solar panels. So they're a couple of the ideas. So I guess my first point is the assets sit there on a bank's balance sheet. The question is two bits. How do you get them off the bank's balance sheet for potentially other investors? And the third bit, how do you enable other money to come in either jointly or in a different way to work with the banks to get the assets they want? Another area for us, specifically around the environmental side, at the moment we're doing a lot of work around the data. So a lot of it's around, around this work I've talked about with CSIRO. And my expectation will be coming out of that, we'll be in a much better position to be able to talk around which farmers are doing a better job in a medium-term view around sustainable farming, which industries are doing a better job managing the resources they've got. A lot of that is anecdotal, a lot of it is, there's a very big qualitative piece in that, but the quantitative bit we've been missing, I think, for some time. And for us, we've been building that into our pricing models, we build that into our decision tools around which loans we lend to and which ones we don't lend to. Another area for us that, and a transaction that we worked on was around the Murray River in Australia, Australia's largest river system called the Murray-Darling. It has challenges where there's a lot of people who pull water out of it for irrigation, for cropping, for food stuff. And the challenge has been a degradation of wetlands. There's a very large wetland area off the back of the Murray-Darling. So we worked with the Nature Conservancy, a not-for-profit, to basically put together a transaction which enabled them to buy and sell water rights. Which they would then buy these water rights and then sell them in the market. So using market forces to determine price, which basically meant that the profit that they made from doing that, which was fundamentally available then for water to be put into the wetlands and solve some conservation issues off the back of that. That was a transaction we did last year, first stage of that, and we're looking to scale that up at the moment. So that sort of gives you a few ideas of some of the things we do. very happy to go into detail, in more detail through the questions.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you a lot. We got a good idea of what you are doing. Sometimes maybe you already have done these things for many years before. Now you put more stress on one side, and sometimes you do the same thing under another name.
On the other side, yeah.
But it has always been done, and this is what we have heard from Bill. Certainly the World Bank always worked for sanitation, water, blah, blah, blah. Now they stress more on one aspect. Now we shall listen to another perspective from Madeleine Ronquist. Madeleine is the head of Environment and Social Risk Management at the first Rand Banking Group in South Africa. Just would like to know from Madeleine, from South African perspective, what is the finance sector doing in terms of financing sustainable development?
I think the scene that I want to set, you probably recognize, because it's not just in South Africa where this has happened, but over in our history, what has typically happened is that externalities like natural capital has never been costed into pricing. And so in the recent past, we've been faced with a problem in electricity supply, and not everybody in South Africa has access to electricity. And we also have been finding difficulties with water restrictions, water constraints, and quality of water. So much so that there is water restrictions in place right now. We're going through a severe drought. And there's also water penalties for overuse. And that has been implemented now to get people to start looking at how they use water and how they should be reducing their water use. So obviously this has all led to increased costs. Now the pricing structure looks different. So in the recent 3 years, electricity prices have gone up by 25% annually. Collectively, an increase of about 300% if you take all the other increases into account. And I think it's because we've been thinking, like the rest of the world, that natural resources are infinite and that we could just use and use and use and it would never stop. We're also sitting in the current economic climate where businesses have halted growth. So they're really very conservative. They don't know what the economy is going to do. They don't know if we're going to be rated down. And so we find that they are not growing their businesses. They're not creating jobs. They're not spending capital on new projects, new buildings, and expansions. What we now have to do is actually go into the market and look at how we can finance and help them reduce operational costs and increase efficiencies, especially in the use of natural resources. And that is where we've found the opportunity. So I think how we've built the foundation of this over the years, and this has been a journey, is firstly in measuring our own operational impact on natural resources. How dependent are we on natural resources? How do we use it? And how does the ecosystem work in business? And now that we measure it, we actually understand a lot better the business case, the impacts, the long-term effects, and the positive impact that it's been having. On the other side of that, we've also been focusing a lot on managing our clients' environmental and social risk, not managing it ourselves, but advising on what natural resource risk they could face, which will restrict their capacity to grow, and also their sustainability. So we ask questions about climate change, about water accessibility, when we think about a long-term relationship with our clients. So where a business doesn't naturally maybe think about this, we have now learned over the years that this is how we should advise on our transactions. For us, there's an inherent credit risk, of course, and then also a reputational risk. So for us, there's also value in this journey that we've been taking in the relationship with our clients. So now we're almost moving to the next frontier where we say, okay, we've learned a lot of lessons and we've faced a lot of many challenges. So how are we going to put that to good use? And now we've moved into the arena of positive impact finance, where and I'm a conservationist, so everything for me works in ecosystems. So we're looking at a circular economy, so from cradle to grave, use of natural resources. So it includes everything from sustainable agriculture, land reform, the use of water, production, and managing your waste. And for us, that is important. And where it's always been functioning in pockets or even silos of intelligence, it now needs to be seen together as the circular economy, which is far more inclusive than what we're currently in, which is very restricted. And so for us, so at a national level, I think the finance sector is focusing a lot on sustainable development finance and green finance. And for us personally as a banking group, just two examples. For us, infrastructure development is also building capacity. So especially in land reform, on energy, on water use and so on, we have an incubator for SMEs, which we teach them about banking, about saving, about putting together a financial balance sheet, and so all the principles that you need to know for business. But we're also saying, how do you use natural resources? How is this going to have an impact on your business? And we're specifically focusing on energy, water, and waste management at the moment. Another example as well is in the socio-economic arena where we have a lot of challenges. We have a relationship with our national parks, for instance, as their banker. And we've had to relook our approach to what we're offering to them as solutions. And we found in their strategic objectives that they really want to focus on the impacts that they are having on the communities immediately surrounding their national parks. And so we've had to think a lot in terms of designing solutions, and those include anything from sustainable agriculture, but creating trade, creating banking solutions to the people that are going to start trading with the parks, the hotels and so on, creating energy from solar and so on, and there are many, many different solutions. But I think that was one of our focus areas where we could actually do both, positive impact finance as well as economic upliftment, economic inclusion, and just have an holistic approach. So for us, what I'm saying is that we've moved away from, not away from, but we've moved from a position of managing risk effectively to now looking at the potential positive impact that the finance sector could have. And of course, we have great influence across all sectors, so it's a no-brainer as to why we should be involved. And for us, positive impact finance means it's the investment in infrastructure and raising the value of natural capital.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. I mean, also, one thing which we should consider now, it might be risky. It will become more risky for the banking sector not to consider the changes after the Paris Agreement and the agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals. It will be risky not to go in that direction, maybe.
Exactly.
Okay. Now we hear another perspective from Japan. Mr. Takehiro Tsuyoshi is the special advisor to the FI for Asia Pacific. He is the CEO of the Green Finance Organization Japan and so many other things. But we know that your organization had an initiative to support equity investment in the SMEs. Can you tell us about this initiative and how does it affect financing of new products?
Allow me to use some slides. Assalamu alaikum. This is only Arabic, I know. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the perspective of Japanese corporations and Japanese financial institutions on natural capital in general. In September this year, UNEP FI and its partners from Japan held natural capital roundtable in Tokyo. Fortunately, we had good and fruitful discussions on what the risks and opportunities of natural capital are to Japanese corporations and financial institutions. Good news is that recently the interest on natural capital is spreading rapidly in Japan. You may have heard Satoyama and Satoumi. Those are symbols how Japanese people used to live in good harmony with nature. The key concept or key spirit was self-sufficiency for sustainability. Natural capital is something classic in Japan. Japan is a country of blessing nature. Having said that, this is a different aspect of how Japan's economy and Japanese life is heavily dependent on natural capital in overseas countries. Among all inputs to Japan's economy, as you can see in this chart, about half material inputs are imported from overseas, and it is more prominent in food and energy. So, on the back of these different aspects, what are the natural capital's implications to Japanese corporations and financial institutions? Supply chain risk management is indispensable on one hand, and on the other hand, we see great potential in terms of eco-friendly new businesses opportunities or eco-friendly new financial instruments or assets. Here, please let me briefly share some of Japanese corporations and the Japanese financial institutions' best practices. Needless to say that those are just for a few examples among others. Oji Paper ensures the Forest Stewardship Council certified paper to be delivered to their customers. Aeon, a leading retailer in Japan, introduced sustainable fishery products labels. Suntory, a major beverage company, commits water sustainability by promoting water resource cultivation. Here are some examples of Japanese banks. SMBC is the first Japanese commercial bank issuing a green bond in 2015. Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Holdings developed environmental rating loans with evaluation of natural capital preservation. Development Bank of Japan is a pioneer of environmental rating loan program since 2004. It is not included in this slide. Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, the largest banking group in Japan, issued its first green bonds that are compliant with total loss absorbing capacity, or TLAC rules. This is a photo of a Green Bank Congress 2016 taking place in Tokyo 2 weeks ago. Green banks or green investment banks, you might know well, are newly established financial institutions that are specialized in promoting a new flow of green capital into green businesses, such as renewable energy projects. As of today, there are 12 institutions in place, and others are emerging all over the world. This year's Congress was the fourth one, after Edinburgh in 2013, New York in 2014, and Kuala Lumpur last year. I hosted the fourth Congress as CEO of Green Bank of Japan. Now I will make a briefing on Green Bank of Japan. It was launched May 2013. Our mission is to accelerate green finance towards a sustainable society in Japan by supporting renewable energy projects. Funding source is climate change mitigation tax or carbon tax levied on fossil fuels in Japan. We are given two goals. The first one is to reduce CO2 emissions. The second one is to revitalize local communities in Japan. As you might know, many regions across Japan have been suffering slow economies, aging, and contracting populations, natural disasters, and so on. So that the encouragement of local communities are very important political issues, political matters in Japan. This is the funding structure to our project. We put tax money into equity as a preferred stockholder. We do not take majority because we want the project sponsors to take full responsibilities of management of their project. We support them actively behind the scene. We do not focus on mega projects, but on a small and medium-sized projects, because there are so many high potential projects that cannot start up just because of shortage of funds. We want to support them. We want to make a final push to them. We have committed to 23 projects with our investment of only $78 million. The average leverage is about 8 times, so that the total project size is about $700 million. So my conclusion today is that renewable energy policy is no longer just an energy policy. It is now a social policy to solve social issues. Preservation of natural capital is a synonym for preservation of local communities. Eventually, natural capital has become a matter of democracy. Lastly, the Paris Agreement has changed our future course from low carbonization to decarbonization. This requires us a dramatic growth of green financing to implement what the Paris Agreement visualizes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very good overview. We don't know a lot of what's happening in Japan, especially with your work, so it was good learning for us. In conclusion, we have Mr. Sean Kidney. He is CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative based in London. And your job now is to tell us, after what you heard, do you think that the finance climate is changing in the world?
Well, look, finance climate is definitely changing. I mean, it's been, I think, 3 years since you and I sat down to talk about this green fund and this green bank, and it's happening in Japan. It's not only the green fund that's happening. It's also that investors, and this is very important for anyone selling a green bond, investors in Japan are quietly amassing portfolios of green bonds, not from Japanese domestic issuance, unfortunately. They're getting it from overseas. So the question to you to think about is, when are we going to kick off domestic issuance in Japan, the world's second largest bond market? Look, the story behind green bonds is rapid growth, still small. Hey, still small. A few years ago, it was only $3 billion a year. Last year, it was $42 billion. This year, it'll be between 80 and 100 billion issuance globally, dollars. So that's not too bad as a growth. Parallels the growth in Sukuk a few years ago. It's a simple instrument. It is simply a bond of any kind where the proceeds are allocated to green. Very easy. It's a marketing idea. Marketing makes all the difference in markets. That's what we've got to remember. So packaging this up and making it easy for investors, as my friends at BlackRock said to me 2 weeks ago, and we publish this report each year saying there may be 150 billion outstanding of labelled green bonds each year, but actually there's 600 billion of climate-aligned bonds. If you want to look, you would have to pick up a few rocks and look underneath, but they are there. But investors don't have the due diligence capability despite having the interest and wanting to do something. As we've heard today in other fora about this, if you make it easy for them, they'll buy. The same way, if we put a packet of biscuits on a supermarket shelf, we're going to buy it. If we have to look under a rock for it, we're never going to buy it. That's what you've got to remember about this market. It is a market that is growing rapidly on the back of investor interest. The big push this year has been China, where the government's made it now official government policy to grow a green bond market. We've seen 20 billion odd of issuance so far, and the central bank thinks there's another 20 billion to come out this year. God knows how they're going to get it done. I guess they mean Chinese New Year, but nevertheless, that's 3 months. It is a bond where we have seen issuance by banks like Steegs Bank and NAB, where we have seen the green RMBS, that's a mortgage-backed security out of the Netherlands, from Obvion, where we have seen municipal issuance from the US, from Europe and from Johannesburg, that did the first landmark municipal issuance out of emerging markets. And we've seen discussion recently about sovereigns. We have now 6 countries saying they're planning to bring out a green sovereign, with France being the first one off the block on that one. Now, there's been a lot of talk for the last few years of green sukuk, Islamic bonds, we might call them. They're actually an equity-style instruments. We do think that next year we will finally, God, it's been a long time, we will finally see this market start moving, probably in Malaysia, not Dubai, unfortunately, unless someone in the room can help me out with this problem. But clearly, this is a momentum of discussion which is tied to the growing appreciation of the need to address climate change. It's not just the rich country phenomena. China, India, is now the 7th largest green bond market in the world. We have Brazil, represented by our friends at the Febraban, the Bankers Association, the front row, having had 2 major bonds out already, and I suspect we're going to see a crop coming through in the next 12 months. It is a market which is about the asset, not the entity. We do not care if you get a good Dow Jones Sustainability Index score. We don't care. What we care about is the asset on the ground. Is there a solar farm there or not? That, of course, opens up opportunities for new issuance. If we're to achieve a rapid change to a green economy, we need existing institutions to invest. One of the best bonds recently was National Thermal Power Company in India, which owns the biggest crop of coal-fired power stations. They have an ambition to fund 10 gigawatt of solar. They've done a green bond backed by a brown balance sheet to finance a future clean energy pipeline. Perfect. That's how we finance the transition going forward. So that's the background to it. The investor-driven aspect is about insurance funds and pension funds being conscious of the long-term risks of their portfolios, scratching their heads and saying, this woman, Catherine Howarth, is chasing me in the UK, and she's over there in the audience. What do I do about it? Well, our portfolio management is 3 to 5 year horizons. Our risk profile for this is 40 years. How do we manage the two together? There's one simple way you do it. If I can offer this man 2 bonds, both with the same risk and yield characteristics, but one has a bonus feature that addresses the 40-year problem, bingo, sweet spot. Suddenly I have demand in spades, and we see substantial oversubscription being the norm. And in liquid markets, we now see downward price pressure as a result of that significant oversubscription. So underlying this and looking forward to the future, 3 propositions for you. The first proposition is we are in a very, very, very bad place when it comes to climate change. Very, very bad. At the moment, we are still tracking to the worst possible scenario of the International Panel of Climate Change. We will see 10-degree temperature rises in the Gulf in the second half of this century on average, and it's hot enough out there as it is. We will see 10-degree average terrestrial temperature rises, 4 to 6 across the world average, 14 degrees in the Arctic. That's the current projection. 2 metres sea level rises is the minimum we will experience. Jim Hansen from NASA says 4 to 6 metres is now looking likely by the end of this century. So there are many reasons Dubai will disappear. And it won't just be the heat, it'll also be the rising sea levels. So we need to understand the dangers, and the risks here are much more than just sea level rises and so on. This is food crisis. This is imploded states. This is a world full of epidemics because of environmental changes. This is a world where we lose at least 1/3 of the world's population. That's what we are currently heading towards, absolutely directory without fail. So understand this. And understand when Christiana Figueres says this is urgent, she also says we have 5 years, not 25 years, not 35 years, 5 years to shift this problem and get emissions turning down. That is the bad side. If you have children, you need to be worrying about this, or nieces or nephews. I have 4 girls and I am very worried about their lives and my grandchildren's lives. It doesn't look very good. That's the bad news. I mean, we can go on for days about that. On the other hand, on the positive side, there are still 2 things that give us hope. 2 things. The first one is that the bulk of what we have to do happens to be infrastructure, and we know how to invest it. 60 to 70% of the investments required to transition to a low-carbon economy are infrastructure, energy, transport, water. This is stuff we know how to finance. We've been doing it for 150 years. We built railways in the US in the 1860s by bringing private capital in, by giving concessions to railway lines for real estate investment. And we built the railways, we built the roads. We need a carbon price, but we are not dependent on a carbon price. So if someone like Exxon comes out 2 weeks ago and says, finally we accept the carbon price, if the carbon price comes in, everything will be fine, tell them to go away. We do not need to wait for a carbon price. All the toolkit is in every treasury of the world. I want to say this, there is no excuse for governments not to act because the toolkit is absolutely there. The second thing I'm going to tell you is that we know how to use the public sector balance sheet efficiently to grow infrastructure. All infrastructure is mediated by the public sector. It's zoning, it's regulation, it's sometimes guarantees, it's bringing in the World Bank, albeit as a leverage institution, not a direct lender. Every development bank in the world has to change its business model because there is not enough capital in public sector institutions. Scale is a problem here. According to the new climate economy, the current valuation of the world's infrastructure is around 50 trillion. Between now and 2030 alone, we are going to invest 94 trillion in infrastructure globally, 65% in emerging markets. This is an unprecedented boom. Unprecedented. And if we don't do it green, our futures are messed up. So there's the challenge. We have to do it. We know how to do it. And then the last thing, the thing that gives me hope, of course, this is not so good for German pension funds at the moment. The things that gives me hope is that we have a world awash in capital. There has never, ever in the history of humankind been as much capital available on the planet now as there is right now. Capital in institutionally investor portfolios. 12% of that is in negative interest rate instruments. My God! Is that an opportunity? Yes, exactly. Thank you. And where is that yield that they need? It is not in Germany. It is not in France. It is not in Japan. I'm sorry. It is in Nigeria. It is in India. It is in Brazil. It is in places where the 67% happens to have to be invested in quick time. And these interest rates aren't going to last. They're probably going to last this level for 5 years. Oh, 5 years. I heard it. Someone said 5 years. Christiana Figueres said 5 years. We have 5 years to act. What? I mean, can you imagine? Could there be a better time in the history of humanity to rebuild the world's infrastructure? The lowest interest rates in recorded history in emerging markets where all the capital is. $94 trillion of projects lining up and queuing to be invested in. And more bankers looking for work than ever before in the history of humanity as well, thanks to 2008. We need the banks, the financial institutions, the development banks to form a bridge between the pools of capital over there and the project pipeline over there. It can be done, it has been done, but the money does need to flow at pace. Timing is of the essence. Mark Carney, the Bank of England, says we need $5 to $7 trillion a year flowing by 2025. We are well below the trillion at the moment. So there's work to be done. My point to you is don't walk, run. Now is the time to run, both because of the urgency of climate change and because of the extraordinary short window of opportunity we have to act. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was so interesting. I didn't stop you because I gave you my time. You wrapped up.
Alfred.
I just tell you two very positive stories to continue on your positive thing. A colleague of mine, we were together at the university. He is on our board of trustees. He is one of the two main shareholders of the biggest oil engineering companies in the world. He sold half of his shares 2 years ago. He kept half. So he diversified. And in what he invested? He created a company, I'll say its name, Al-Khazar Capital, based in Dubai. It invests only in renewable energy. So the world is changing. Another member on my board of trustees from a neighboring country, we published a report on sustainable energy 3 years ago, which called for phasing out subsidies. He resigned. He said, this is against oil. Now his country is in the forefront. We told them, prepare for soft landing. They are in the forefront of crash landing. They phased out everything because they cannot afford anymore. And he returned to our board. So the world is changing. Now, we shall have 5 minutes for questions and answers. Please keep the question within 1 minute and the answer within 1 minute. So I shall stand so that I can see. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jumoke Kasim from Nigeria. Please, I'd like to find out what is the low interest rate that is available and how can we access it? Thank you.
You want to take a couple? Or?
No, I mean if you answer fast, it will be more efficient.
Look, there is a big challenge in challenging Nigeria, in converting Nigerian risk into assets that northern investors will accept. At the end of the day, the bulk of Nigeria's infrastructure will be financed domestically. We need to work on developing capital resources in Nigeria. There already are substantial capital resources. But in the short term, the spearhead of the revolution will be northern investors going into Nigeria. But there's an awful lot of risk enhancement. Now, there's one institution sitting up at this panel that could do all the risk enhancement we need, bringing in the other development banks. It's the World Bank. They need to be creating structures of various sorts to take first loss risk, various other risks, to allow Nigerian investments to be made. Of course, the Nigerian industry needs to sort out some governance issues as well to allow the World Bank to get into that. But this is what we can do. We know how to do that. It is a bit complicated once you get into it. There will need to be some risk bridging to make it work, but it can be done.
Yes?
Varda Malik, my question is to the panel, whoever wants to answer. You've been in the field of investing in environmental related assets. And it's essentially impact investment, which has been picking up for the past 7-8 years now. What has been your experience in terms of returns that you make on such investments? Are they as financially viable as your traditional investments, or you take a hit because they're climate friendly?
In my case, it's all debt. You know, I'm a banker, I'm a commercial banker. It's all debt. Returns are comparable with everything else I do. I think it comes into how you think around you risk weighting, and that's a feature for us. But I look across the portfolio. For us, it's how do we transition to a lower carbon world, and it's fair to say the returns on my renewable side of my portfolio would be broadly consistent with that of the dirty side, but it's definitely more sustainable, so we give it a tick. So it's more likely to do, and we're doing a lot more on the renewable than I am on the other traditional.
In terms of equity, because you're largely doing equity investments, how has your experience been? Do you make more money in equity rather than, in traditional equity?
Yeah.
The reason why we put into equity portion is that we want to be part of ownership. That means we can stay with the project for a long time, at least 10 years time. So much different from a one-time, grant, one-time subsidiary, we can stay with project. And during that period of our ownership, we can support that project in many ways. So we find equity as a very important instrument to support local people promoting projects. Yeah. That is the reason. And we use tax money so that we don't want to be very profitable. Our expected return is around 3 to 4% instead of 5 or 6, 7 by commercial banks.
Before we go to another question,
I just wanted to get back to the lady asking a question about the returns on investment. We're not a commercial bank. I mean, we're a multilateral institution. And when we invest in environmental assets, actually the returns are much higher in terms of how we calculate them, because we factor in the social benefits, we factor in other benefits that typically a financial institution would not consider in the returns. Sorry? No, exactly. Yeah, the ROI or ERR. So, where does the benefit accrue to is very, very important. So how can we structure investments in environmental assets in a way where you can value the benefits to their full value and really make it interesting? And perhaps this would require different types of risk sharing and maybe benefit sharing as well.
Yes.
The question I have is that given the rapid change that is taking place in the industry in respect of climate change, risk, opportunity, both, is there in your mind a view that perhaps more specialized financial institutions are required? Because what I see is that people approach the large banks. The large banks, it doesn't move the needle for them to ask them to focus on something that may be today a niche. And whether the large bank needs to spin out a specialized entity with expertise, with data, with risk management, risk evaluation, and an ability to form a bridge from the northern capital sources into developing markets which are already difficult to, shall we say, assess in terms of risk because of, the lack of governance, the lack of many, many other issues that are there. So in my view, if you really want to get this thing to move, you really need to create the incentive at a smaller level for a group of people whose bread is buttered on that and not on, I'm doing a big LNG project, by the way, I'm doing the big project in Australia for whatever. They need to move away from that because there is only so much management time available. Thank you.
I think it's a great, I question that. So I think the market will develop as the market needs, and there will be specialist funds or specialist banks, if you like. The problem with the bank, certainly in the Australian market, the brand of a bank, it's very hard to be a bank in Australia. And to be a small bank in Australia, forget it. You'll do nothing. All you'll be doing is paperwork all the time, giving it to people, right? So that's the challenge. So the challenge in my world is we've got a small group of people who know what they're doing within a bigger organisation. The challenge I've got is bring the organisation with me in terms of how we're trying to do things. So it's trying to get the best of both worlds. The challenge of that's how I see it. It's the best of both worlds. I think for us, I think when I look outside the banking system, I don't think you'll mobilise the debt. Equity, I think, is a different story. But in terms of debt, I struggle to see how you do it.
Just as a follow-up, you see, there is a large group of population that is underserved in emerging markets for financial access. And agreed. For us to continue to ask the big banks to try to solve their problem, it's like round hole square peg business. It's not going to work. And so therefore, much as you are focused on what gets you your return on equity, there is a larger need out there. And that requires an institution and requires the creation of those entities that are fully, looking at that opportunity for their main return. And therefore, the top management's this thing, whether it is fintech that will come to the answer, whether it is more digitization, but at some point that market will be served. And my point is that you need to accelerate that rather than to say, well, you know, I think I'm doing a good job because I think a lot of underserved population may disagree. Maybe not in Australia, but certainly in Bangladesh, certainly in India, certainly in Pakistan, certainly in, you know, many parts of the world.
But I guess my view is that the market will determine that. Honestly, I just view that'll come through.
That market accelerating, and is there a need to make it accelerate?
Look, we have acceleration already. I mean, look at what's happened in Nigeria with the development of M-Pesa and so on, and different financial mechanisms, institutions in Kenya, I should say, institutions coming forward. We have in China, I met the CEO of Ant Financial recently, which is now an $80 billion fintech banking company. This has appeared out of nowhere in the last few years. So we're getting those changes in many markets. I think they're happening relatively organically. It's not so good for the incumbent banks like NAB unless they're fleet-footed, as some are. So it's perfectly true. Do we need to create specialist public sector institutions is the underpinning of your question, really. And there I'm going to say, yes, there is some benefit in having specialist teams where there's a bit of a desert. But if you're trying to win a battle, you can build new cities or you can take the existing castles. There's room to do a bit of both. Yeah. The biggest game is to take the existing castles. The World Bank is almost taken, wouldn't you say? But some of the other ones aren't quite taken yet. And one of our jobs is to paint them all green from the inside and win these arguments that it isn't a contradiction, that there isn't development and green over here, that they must be the same, that there isn't infrastructure and green, that they must be the same. They're the kind of arguments within big institutions we need to win. So the answer is there's a real need for ginger catalyst institutions, like the Japanese institutions. They're great, but don't keep your eye off the big battle, which is to convert our existing institutions, mainly because of the speed at which we can act. It takes years to set up new institutions. You can win battles of existing institutions faster, is my try. I'm going to keep saying 5 years. We will know in 5 years whether our kids have a future.
Very quickly, in order to move big banking corporations, we need to review existing banking regulations, as Basel III is now being, reviewed.
Yeah, but you see, you are making a stick to them because you're saying you have to take. I'm offering an opportunity and a carrot to a smaller guy who doesn't need a stick. He is self-propelled, and by the time he's done, he is going to take on the big banks in their domain, and he is going to disrupt all of that. The big banks are not competing with other big banks. They're competing with the small guy with tech and the ability to do it cheaper, faster, and all of that, and he's going to take on all of this. So I think it's really in denial if you say, well, let the big guys do it. I think it's enough of the G20, enough of the finance ministers, enough of the central bank governors. I want to leave it to the guy in the garage to make the solution in emerging markets. And it's not going to come from the north. It will be a solution for emerging markets by emerging markets. Thank you.
Is there any other opinion from the floor? I'm scanning from right to left, and that's it, it seems. So any one of you feels he has to say the last word?
No, méchant.
Okay.
Well, sorry, are you giving us license to speak further?
Yeah.
That's very exciting. Let me pick up this emerging market story. I just want to stress 60 to 70% of what we have to invest the next 15 years in infrastructure is in emerging markets. So yes, the financial solutions need to be in emerging markets. However, the bulk of that investment is going to be larger scale stuff or larger scale common type like solar rooftops. It's going to be transport, rail, it's going to be urbanisation at scale. It's India's new cities, or it's renovating the whole of the central part of Mumbai. Quite big projects, you've got to bear in mind. So we will need both sorts of institutions. We'll need institutions that can work to large groups of people to bring them into the sector, and we will need institutions like large banks who can finance infrastructure. But there's one thing that we will need above all that we don't currently have adequately in every country in the world, and that is leadership ambition for the change. We have it in a couple of places now. China is shifting its economy around, trying to shift a filthy economy, because they made so many mistakes in the last 20 years, despite bringing 500 million people out of poverty. So many mistakes. India has now set these extraordinary top-down targets for energy, for water, for transport, which are fantastic. Now we need Nigeria to set those targets for what the economy will look like in 2050. We need Brazil. Now, BNDES announced a couple of weeks ago, no more coal being financed by BNDES. Fantastic, which is the Brazilian Development Bank. We need the government to actually think about what the economy is going to look like in 2050 and then start building quickly towards that. And that's every country in the world. This is taking the climate change plans, called the INDCs, the last COP, and turning them into national capital raising plans to deliver on it, and then thinking about the capital formation, the capital allocation, and the deal-making required, including regulatory measures underneath. That will pick up your agenda about inclusion. It'll also pick up the agenda about Basel III and Solvency II, which do need reform to make sure that we invest fast enough.
Okay, thanks a lot. I hope that you enjoyed it and you learned of this session as much as I did. It was the first time I meet those people, but when I saw the list, I was interested before I met them to listen, and I think we all learned new things from different parts of the world. The most important message, I think, from this session is that we all have positive outlook. So this is one of the rare times after years we have positive outlook. Even when we doubt things, we know that we should do it the right way. Thanks a lot.